Hi, Misha here, and I've covered some of the battleships, I've covered some of the carriers. Now let's talk about some of the cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy before and during World War II. And we will get to the more modern, larger cruisers, but in this video, let's start with the first heavy cruisers ever in the Japanese Navy, also known to them as the A-class cruisers. And originally, these were to be 4 in the Furutaka class, but they would only build Furutaka herself and Kako or Kako. Then the design would be modified enough that it would become its own class, the Aoba class, and it would have its own sister ship, Kinugasa, or whatever. So they would build 4, and they're very similar, but there are enough differences that we'll talk about between the two classes to make them separate. These were designed following World War I and were built to match or outclass U.S. cruisers like the Omaha or British cruisers like the Hawkins. And they did just that. They ended up being as fast or faster and having very heavy broadsides with cannon, and they would kind of start a trend with Japanese destroyers and cruisers of having a very heavy, very capable torpedo armament. And all 4 of these would be laid down in the 20s and initially commissioned between 1926 and 1927. And all 4 would go through reconstruction in the mid to late 1930s, being available for service at the beginning of the war in the Pacific in 1941. So with that, let's get into it. Talk a bit about each. All 4 ships were actually ordered and laid down very close together, but Furutaka and Kako were the first, and both were commissioned quite close together in 1926. Now the models here are the usual 1,100 scale diecast from Eaglemoss, and the one of Furutaka here is 1926 when she initially launched. The one of Kako over here is 1942, I believe, World War II configuration, after a couple of rebuilds. The ship was a little over 607 feet long, had a crew of around 625, was capable of steaming up to 34.5 knots, and was between about 7,100 and 9,500 tons, depending on the loading. Initially, as the Furutaka model shows here, she was launched with 6 7.9-inch guns and single mount so-called semi-turrets. She had a very minimal anti-aircraft battery and a secondary battery of a few smaller guns, and a very respectable torpedo loadout in twin tubes for that time. Really, all 4 of these ships will start off with Cruiser Division 5 and move on to 6, and then from there into World War II. And initially they were assigned to kind of patrol off the Chinese coast. In 1929, Kako was actually the first of the 2 to go in for the first reconstruction. This would add more anti-aircraft defense, and it would add a catapult for one seaplane. After this, Furutaka would go in 1931 for the same rebuild, and both would be back to operating in 1934. However, beginning in 1936, you would get the major rebuild. First, again, Kako would go in, and then Furutaka a year later. And both would be done around 1939. The biggest difference are the guns. They deleted the 6 semi-turrets with one 7.9-inch gun each, and they went to 2 guns per turret and 3 turrets, so twin turrets, with a new 8-inch gun. Now, interestingly, the turret, was actually developed in 1924, so before either ship was commissioned. However, they had both been laid down, and construction was just too far along at that time, so they waited. They integrated the new turrets. They added more modern torpedo armament. They also added torpedo bulges to some extent. They increased the electrical power. They rebuilt and modernized the bridge, adding lots of new equipment, so on and so forth. So both were ready in 1941 December during the Pearl Harbor attack, although while all 4 of these would kind of sail together during that event, they would actually sail supporting the landing invasion of Guam. Afterwards, they would return briefly to Truk in early 1942, and then really between January and May, or really April I should say, of that year, they would support various landings and do various patrols. In May, they would be assigned to what would end up being the Battle of the Coral Sea. On May 7th, they were assigned to protect the aircraft carrier Shoho, which they didn't do well because it sank. Another carrier there was heavily damaged, so on the 8th, the sisters were split up. Furutaka would go back with the damaged carrier as an escort to Japan, whereas Kako would continue on to support other operations. But this wouldn't last long. By July, they would, as the Japanese Navy would kind of be reformed following Midway and all that, they would be joined back together. And then they would have a major event, along with several other cruisers, on August 9th at the Battle of Savo Island, which was a night engagement, which the Japanese were quite trained on, proficient at. And it would be a pretty big victory for them, and they would sink or damage quite a few American ships. And both of the cruisers here would survive, although sometimes by near misses. But their luck wouldn't hold for that much longer. As always, hope I'm getting something on camera for you. Do my best. Yeah, both survived the Battle of Savo Island without really a scratch. But Kako's luck would very quickly run out. Just the next day, she was ordered to split off again, and along with a few other ships, go essentially unescorted. And unfortunately, she was at the tail. She was last in line, which meant when a U.S. submarine spotted the convoy that next morning, around 7 a.m., she fired 3 torpedoes at the last ship, which was Kako, and 3 of the 4 hit, very quickly knocking holes in her and then she listed over, rolled over, and then when this happened, her boilers hit the seawater, she exploded, and that was it. She went under very quickly. Furutaka's luck would actually hold. She would survive near misses by B-17 bombers and submarines throughout the rest of August and into September. She would do a routine patrol and then be called in to be part of the Guadalcanal campaign to support the Japanese trying to take Henderson Field and all of that. But on October 12th, her luck would run out too, off of what is known as Cape, I can't talk today, Esperance. During that battle, the Japanese admiral in charge made a fatal error. You can read about it. This led quickly to Aoba being knocked out, and Furutaka would assume command, but this would not last long either. She would be shelled and torpedoed, so quickly joining her sister under the waves just under 2 months later. So neither one would survive 1942. So what about their half-sisters? This time, both of our models are from World War II. Aoba herself is circa 1944, and Kinugasa is circa 1942. Well, as I mentioned, there was a new gun and a new turret, twin turret type system. I should say gun mount to be exact, in 1924. Well, the Furutakas were too far along, but the last two ships in the class weren't. So these were built from the ground up for the new twin 7.9-inch turret. So it would have 6 of the new, of the same guns basically, but in twin turrets. Also, they would be built with new technologies in mind, for example, airplane catapults. And they would correct a few other deficiencies felt to be in the Furutakas. So these would be commissioned really a short time later in 1927 and briefly be used for patrols. Now, Kinugasa would be the first Japanese naval ship to launch an aircraft in 1928. And then in 1929 she would be accidentally rammed by a Japanese submarine, I-55, during a training exercise when she was pretending to do a torpedo run. That's fun. And then in 1930 they were slotted for reconstruction and rebuilding, but really not much happened until 1938. Both ships would go in and receive many of the same upgrades as the Furutakas. Now, since they already had the twin turrets, that was good. The gun mounts were good, but they did get this slightly improved 8-inch gun, as well as more anti-aircraft defense. And their aircraft carrying capability was upped from 1 to 2, at least as an option. It's worth saying that these are the same dimensions, about 607 feet, had the same crew. Because of slightly more material, they were a little bit slower at about 34 knots even. But yeah, pretty much the same, because they were built on the same hull, had the same basic armor and whatnot as the Furutakas. Both were recommissioned at the end of 1940 and were available for World War II, and really their service records mirror the Furutakas because they all served in Cruiser Division 6 from the invasion of Guam in December 41 through 42, and all were there for the Battle of the Coral Sea. Again, these would split apart on May 8th, with them joining back up in July, and again they would all be there for the Battle of Savo Island. And again, they would more or less escape unharmed, although they would have some minor shell damage, nothing major though. I think one lost a float plane, things of that nature. So far, their luck is holding out. Well, assigned as part of the Guadalcanal campaign to shell Henderson Field to help the ground forces, they would set sail, and during the battle off of Cape Esperance, Kinugasa would take 4 shell hits, doing only moderate damage, really, not bad. On the other hand, she would actually do some pretty good damage to the USS Boise, knocking out a couple of her turrets. She would briefly return to port to get some repairs done, and then come back to her original assignment on October 14th, begin shelling Henderson Field. After that was over, she would support troops as best she could for about a month. But then her time was up on November 14th, when at the naval engagement as part of the Guadalcanal campaign, she was first hit by a 500-pound bomb pretty much right in front of her bridge, which was bad. It decimated the bridge, killing the captain and first officer, injuring many others. It also started a fire in her gasoline storage fuel tank system, and the ship started to list. It was around 9 a.m., I suppose, in the morning during the battle. For a while, she stayed afloat, but then about 2 hours later, the second wave of bombers came in and hit her repeatedly. This would obliterate her propellers, rudders, engines, ripping open her side, exposing many compartments to the seawater, starting more fires, explosions, and she quite promptly rolled over and halfway sink exploded at the same time, thus ending her career. Like I said, this model is from 1942, so that was pretty much her final configuration after her 1938-40 major refit. Well, Aoba would continue on. However, she probably kind of wished she hadn't. Her career following Guadalcanal was very interesting and very good for the Allies. Up till this point, Aoba had been pretty lucky. Yeah, in August she had been hit by a shell, but it didn't do much damage. And so she was available in September, and she helped protect convoys taking supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal, what's known as the Tokyo Express. And then, of course, in October, she was part of the whole operations, they're taking Henderson Field. But before she could get there, she was intercepted at the battle off of Cape Esperance, and she took a beating. She was hit by 40 some odd 6-inch and 8-inch shells, and had her second turret damaged out of action, and her third turret just kind of obliterated. And from there, she also would have several boilers knocked out. Her bridge would be hit, seems to be a recurring thing, killing 81 crew, including the admiral in charge. Remember I said this is when Furutaka, I would assume. And you would think that this would be kind of her end, but she managed to limp back to a nearby port. And, On October 15th, Admiral Yamamoto himself inspected Aoba and ordered her sent back to Japan for repairs because they needed all the ships they could get, and she would get there in early December and would be undergoing repairs and refit until the end of February 1943. So she was back in the fleet, back in the fight. Yeah, except in April, just not even 2 months after she was back in action, she was hit during a bombing raid by a B-17. And, just to be helpful, the B-17 came down and, strafed the decks with machine gun fire. Yeah, the Americans weren't really happy with the Japanese at this point. She was pretty badly mauled. Well, to keep her from sinking, they had to beach her. Oh, did I mention that when that bomb hit from the B-17, it actually ignited 2 of the cruiser's own long-launch torpedoes, so that was fun. She was towed to a truck and then on to Japan, arriving back in August of 1943 for yet more repairs. Originally, during the first repair cycle, they had just plated over her third turret, the one that had been obliterated, and installed the triple anti-aircraft mount in its place. They also gave her first radar set. Well, during this reconstruction, they restored the rear turret, and they moved the aircraft guns around a bit, adding some more, and they gave her a new radar for searching surface of the ocean. And, she was put back into service and would be used for convoy escort and some patrol duties for a bit. But on October 11 of 1944, her run of luck would continue. Aoba had already been beat up a bit and had been in service for quite some time. In fact, due to previous damage, her maximum speed was only 25 knots now. The engines were just toast. They couldn't be repaired fully. And you'd think this would be about as bad as it could get, but it actually just is beginning. On the 11th of October, 1944, she had a collision with a fellow Japanese ship, which only did minor damage. Then, on October 23, she was spotted by a U.S. sub, and while 6 torpedoes were fired, only 1 found its mark. The problem is it found its mark in the number 2 engine room, doing damage to already damaged system. So Aoba would have to limp, crawl, swim, float over to occupied Manila for repairs. So, safe in port? Of course not. Just a week later, she was caught in a Allied air raid and had some near misses and some minor hits. And it was determined that she should be sent, since the repairs had only been partially completed from before and new damage had been added then, sent back with a convoy already heading to Japan. So in November, that's exactly what she did. She got a little lucky. U.S. submarines did attempt to attack her. They did attack the convoy and damage other ships, but for once, Aoba was unscathed. I guess maybe they just felt sorry for her. She would reach QA in Japan on December 12th. They would take one look at her and go, nope. She was considered just not worth or even able to be salvaged. So she was designated as a reserve ship and was just kind of left docked there. And her luck would just keep on getting better. In April of 1945, during one of the many air raids on the naval installation, she would be hit. She would more or less sink, but it was shallow water. She would keep afloat. She would have a bunch more of the wonderfully effective 25mm anti-aircraft guns put on her. I think they had as many as 50 at one time. And be redesignated again as a floating anti-aircraft battery. So she's not even really a ship at this point. And she doesn't really float that great either. She would continue in this role for a few months, but then on a big raid in July of 1945, specifically on the 24th, she would be hit and sunk, but again, shallow water, so still kind of visible. And really, just to lay it on thick, about 5 days later, she would be just obliterated with multiple bombs. I mean, she's already underwater, but now they're just breaking the hull apart. I mean, they break off parts of it, and it's just shattered on the seafloor at this point. So even though she really hadn't been a viable ship of war for the better part of a year, now she's not even a viable reef for fish, really, because she's in too many pieces. And that would be the final one of these 4 ships. So she did make it to 1945, sort of, to exist, of Japan's first A-class destroyer, or carrier. Well, I can't talk. Cruisers. I'm apologizing for this video too. My camera has been real temperamental. I don't know. It's been this way for a week or so. But yeah, I just enjoy talking about these Eaglemoss models, and they're pretty neat. The hulls are all metal. They come with little stands. They've got good detail. And what I like, especially you can see it with the Furutakas, even if they might do 2 ships of the same class, they often do them of different configurations. Like, it's nice to have the reconstructed World War II for Kako, and to have the original 1926 style for Furutaka, because you don't see many of these. And even with these over here, Aoba and Kinugasa, they are different configurations. It's mostly in the rear section, you can tell. Also the addition of radar on Aoba. But they do take the time to do the differences. So I think that's neat. Plus they have little airplanes on them, which always delight me. But yeah, I will get to the other big cruisers, and then we'll probably move on to light cruisers, and hell, maybe even destroyers and stuff. Why not? I appreciate you tuning in. If you could like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.